Goblin Slayer goes full-on berserk in a bloody, ballistic, and badass episode. You know, Goblin Slayer might be one of the most contentious anime of 2018. It really can't seem to catch a break. There are some people that feel that it's a little too lowbrow, that it just relies on violence and stylistic action. And really, even in that sense, it's not exactly reinventing the anime wheel at any time. Then there are those who believe that it's just the type of anime you can watch and kick back and relax and just take it for what it is. Don't overthink it too much. It's a dark fantasy anime series. But honestly, I think that this was a pretty stellar episode of Goblin Slayer that's honestly giving the series the credit that I think it actually deserves. It's easy to write this off as just a generic dark fantasy anime series, but this episode was packed to the brim with some amazing action and some amazing moments from the character of Goblin Slayer himself. In fact, I would go as far as to say that this is the best episode of the series thus far. It was also an episode which absolutely shocked me with its violence and extreme imagery. I actually thought that they were going to take a note from the very first episode and kill off the entire cast yet again. I was fully convinced that the priestess, the lizard man, the high elf archer, and the dwarf were all going to be eliminated by a group of super pissed off goblins. Hell, I thought they might even do something as bold as to kill off the Goblin Slayer in this episode, as he does battle with a group of goblins and a massive goblin champion, which almost kills him. This is the most damage that he has sustained yet in the series, and yet all it really managed to do was just piss him off even further. This episode, my friends, was metal. So first off, let me just go ahead and say that this episode right here is kind of like a super violent and more extreme version of the scene from The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, where Frodo and his party go into the mines of Moria. They get trapped in this room which is suddenly filled with orcs, and then they're attacked by a giant cave troll. Goblin Slayer and his team go down into the sewers where they're trapped in a room which is filled with all sorts of poisonous gas. The goblins come in, their leader comes in, who is a goblin champion, which is basically just like the ogre that we saw from the previous episodes, and then they just fight. And things get really freaking intense as these goblins are not kidding around, especially the goblin champion, who manages to knock Goblin Slayer off his feet and send his ass flying across the room. All of the images of him constantly coughing up blood from his helmet is just so freaking intense. You're almost convinced that this is the moment where the character is going to die, and everybody starts to get attacked left and right, and even using their signature abilities is not going to save them. Even the priestess ends up getting a massive chunk of her arm bitten off by this goblin champion, in a scene which is absolutely ghastly and horrifying. Her screams reverberating through my head as I was watching it. It was terrifying. I was like, yeah, everybody's about to die again. I shouldn't have gotten attached to these characters. It's sad seeing these characters who have been built up as these amazing warriors to get just made fools out of by these goofy little goblins. It's insane. The scene with the high elf archer as her clothes are being ripped off and it looks like she's going to be raped just like the girl from the first episode was terrifying, even more so now that we've actually gotten to know her. This was a really dark and bleak episode, and if it wasn't for the Goblin Slayer going completely berserker mode, they would not have survived at all. But I truly love Goblin Slayer's resourcefulness. It's one of the best things about the series. Even when he doesn't seem to have the best weapon on hand, he's able to utilize his environment to his advantage, and even uses that to take down his enemies in an extremely awesome fashion. Basically, after getting attacked by this goblin champion, he actually is able to utilize human hair to choke this thing. Because when they actually go into this room for the very first time, they're actually lured in by this person who apparently looks like they're tied up, but it's actually just a skeleton that has human hair on it. And he's able to take just like a couple threads of this to wrap it around this giant goblin's neck to actually choke him as he's being repeatedly slammed into a wall, constantly coughing up blood as he does it. But he never manages to back down, even punching this thing in the eye, causing blood to just explode all over the screen in an epic fashion. I didn't even mention the ridiculous and over-the-top Matrix shot. There's this very obvious CG shot where the Goblin Slayer is just ripping through a group of goblins. We get to see it go through like this big turn camera movement, and it's really cheesy, but come on guys, you have to admit, that was pretty freaking awesome. But it's that moment where Goblin Slayer just gets royally pissed off, his eyes start glowing red, and he lets out his amazing phrase, "This shall not stand," when he goes insane just killing all these goblins. It's done with a lot of gusto and probably the most atmospheric animation that I've seen from the show. Even though some of the CG can be a little jarring, I still found myself getting really sucked into the hardcore action of this episode. And believe it or not, he actually manages to save the day. This goblin champion and his group of goons end up running away, and we get to see that even the priestess is going to be fine. If she was bitten just a little bit more, she might have actually died. The episode ends with Goblin Slayer being taken over to the priestess, who manages to let her know that everything's fine, these type of things happen every day, before suddenly collapsing, implying that maybe the Goblin Slayer is going to die in this episode. It's hard to say. The episode tries to be all Evangelion-like at the very end when we get this close-up shot of a canary's eye, which is constantly blinking for over a minute and a half. I'm not sure what they're trying to do here. Maybe they're just trying to be overly artsy. It was the only part of the episode that I found myself not enjoying. But aside from that, I thought that this was a pretty fucking badass episode of Goblin Slayer. And here's why in the rundown of this episode. This was a pretty simple episode of Goblin Slayer. It really just amounted to him and his team going into the sewers, getting their asses handed to them by goblins, and just barely managing to escape because he choked a big dude with some hair. But the way that it was actually done, the amount of desperation that was portrayed from this team was, I think, honestly pretty high caliber. The actual animation, the artwork, it's really nothing to write home about, but this is a show that absolutely bleeds atmosphere, and it truly takes advantage of a lot of that in this episode. The scenes of Goblin Slayer losing himself to the fact that he might actually die, barely making it back just from dying. That moment right there was incredibly powerful and supplied with amazing action. I think my favorite moment is when he's actually getting up from the rubble after being attacked by a champion goblin, where he takes his shield and just slams it into the face of this other goblin, which ends up impaling it on a wall. It's really fucking sick, but honestly, that's what I think we should be expecting to see from Goblin Slayer at this point. If you love metal music and you love the overall imagery of everything that is metal, then I think Goblin Slayer is really something that you need to check out, because it's absolutely not being pretentious about it at all. What is pretentious is long overblown scenes of watching birds blink their eyes. I don't know, that final scene didn't do it for me. I think a lot of other anime series try to do that, where they take a scene and go uncomfortably long with it. To me, it just comes across as a Conway Twitty joke, and I just don't like it. Especially because it's very obvious that even though they want you to think that Goblin Slayer is going to die, they're not going to kill off the main character, and they're especially not going to do it like this. Really, they're just trying to add up the fact that while Goblin Slayer is very good at his job, even he has some glaring weaknesses and is human. He himself can be killed. I think it was really important to establish that in this episode. The fact that even though these characters are pretty freaking awesome, even they can be susceptible if they're overwhelmed by all of these disturbing little creatures. Also, if you wanted some fan service, guess what? Boom! There's a lot of it at the beginning of this episode. Yes, there is a bathing scene between the priestess and the sword maiden, and yeah, it's pretty freaking steamy. So if you're trying to think that Goblin Slayer is going to be some sort of like really high-end Wagyu steak, don't look at it that way. This is a steak and shake burger. It's fatty and greasy and awesome. It gives you instant satisfaction, and it doesn't try to pretend to be anything else. At least in the final shot of the canary blinking its eyes. God, that was stupid. The episode also had a surprising amount of emotion behind it. I think the scene that hit me the most was when the High Elf Archer started to break down at the end of the episode, realizing that they just barely survived this moment. It's also obvious that she has feelings for Goblin Slayer, but then again, he's basically a giant chick magnet. So let's just wrap up this episode. This was a really breakneck, super tense, and action-packed episode with some amazingly awesome imagery in it, some really fun and fast action, an episode which played to the strengths of Goblin Slayer, an episode that you must watch if you are continuing to follow the series. I'm going to give this episode, even with some of its faults, a 5 out of 5. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's Goblin Slayer. Slayer. It's entertaining as hell, and it's doing exactly what it's promising, giving us some awesome dark fantasy action. And if you have to fault it for anything, I guess you could look at some of the production details. But as far as entertainment value goes, there's a reason why Goblin Slayer is one of the most popular shows this season. It's not for its animation, it's not for its action, it's just simply that it's popcorn entertainment, it's fun to watch, and there's nothing wrong with that at the end of the day. You can have your steak, and you can have your hamburger too. And this is a pretty damn good hamburger. So there it is. That's my thoughts on the episode. 5 out of 5. I'd love to hear yours, however. If any of you guys did watch the episode, tell me what you thought about it in the comment section below and what you hope to see from the rest of the Goblin Slayer anime series. Thank you all for watching this review. I'll see you all next time. And as always, stay down now, baby.